Welcome back, I'm Austin, and today I've gathered cases of snake handlers who get fatally bitten by their animals. From an Australian ranger who caught one eastern brown snake before another struck from the shadows, to a former inmate rebuilding his life at a reptile rescue when a forest cobra shot through a feeding hatch into his neck. But let's start first, in Vietnam, where a grandfather teaching his grandson to handle king cobras makes one final mistake. It was July 12, 2018. On the outskirts of Hoi An in Vietnam's Quang Nam province. Monsoon clouds hung low above flooded rice fields, while buses and motorbikes pushed through the humid late afternoon traffic. Small food stalls stayed open beneath metal awnings as warm wind carried the smell of wet soil, canal water, and cooking oil through the narrow roadside buildings. One of the stall owners was Than Nguyen, 67 years old. He spent most of his life serving food, and his small roadside kwan was known for spicy bowls of bun bo, cheap rice liquor, and the cloudy jars of homemade snake wine lined up behind the counter. He was also known as the Snake Whisperer, and actually gained a reputation among villagers as someone who understood cobras better than local wildlife officers. His 16-year-old grandson Kevin spent school breaks helping around the restaurant. Kevin's mother believed he mostly washed dishes and carried produce, but Than had quietly spent nearly 2 years teaching him how to handle snakes. Than explained posture, strike range, and how king cobras reacted differently from smaller vipers. To him, it's passing down a family trade. Behind the kitchen sat a cramped storage room smelling of damp wood, fish sauce, and reptile musk. Wildlife officers later estimated the king cobra measured close to 10 feet long. King cobras can deliver massive venom yields capable of progressively shutting down the muscles responsible for breathing, especially after deep bites near major blood vessels. Thang noticed warning signs before opening the enclosure. The cobra had refused food for over a week. It stayed low against the floor instead of hooding, while tracking movement with slow tongue flicks. Earlier that morning, a produce vendor quietly warned him that the snake looked unusually tense while he cleaned around the cage. But this is the part that stands out to me. There are warning signs, but his instinct slowly gets replaced by confidence. Kevin stood near the doorway filming, while Than explained how experienced handlers controlled the upper portion of a cobra before lifting it safely. Then habit took over. Instead of securing the head first, Than reached toward the midsection, expecting the snake to rise defensively before reacting. But it never gave him the chance. The cobra surged upward from the enclosure floor and struck before Than could pull away. Kevin later said he barely understood what happened until replaying the footage afterward. The snake hit Than directly in the left forearm below the elbow. Both fangs penetrated deeply before the cobra dropped beneath a wooden shelf along the wall. Than stumbled backward while blood ran down his arm onto the concrete floor. Kevin lowered the phone as Than calmly told him to call emergency services and stay away from the enclosure. Even after the bite, Than still secured the cage door using his uninjured hand, before lowering himself onto a wooden stool beside the kitchen wall. For several minutes, he appeared stable. Kevin pressed cloth against the puncture wounds while emergency dispatchers instructed him to keep the arm still and avoid tightening anything around it. According to reports, Than actually able to talk to his grandson. However, roughly 10 minutes after the bite, his eyelids began drooping noticeably. His speech became thick and uneven. Saliva collected near the corners of his mouth while he struggled to swallow normally. Kevin later said the first thing that scared him was hearing his grandfather's breathing change. Around 25 minutes after the strike, Than could no longer keep his head upright without leaning against the wall. His chest movements became shallow and irregular as the paralysis spread through the muscles controlling his breathing. Kevin stayed on the phone with dispatchers while repeating his grandfather's instructions aloud so he would remember them later. Emergency responders arrived roughly 45 minutes after Kevin's call. By then, Than was barely breathing on his own and drifting in and out of consciousness. Paramedics attempted airway management during transport to the nearest hospital, but he's already in a critical condition. He was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. A coroner summary later described the cause of death as acute neurotoxic envenomation from a king cobra bite leading to respiratory paralysis and oxygen deprivation. Wildlife officers removed the cobra later that evening. The restaurant closed within days and never reopened. Within weeks, the family destroyed the remaining snake wine jars behind the abandoned restaurant. What gets me about Than's story is how calm he stayed after the bite. Even while the venom was shutting down his breathing, he was still trying to protect his grandson. But Warren's case proves something even worse. Sometimes experience and caution still aren't enough. It was September 18, 2017, in Ipswich, Queensland. Temperatures climbed past 93 degrees as dry wind pushed through the neighborhoods bordering the bushland. The heat had already driven several snakes out from the tall grass and drainage areas around nearby homes, which meant local wildlife officers had been receiving more snake calls than usual that afternoon. Warren Pickett was 63 and only 2 shifts away from retirement after nearly 40 years with Queensland Parks and Wildlife. Around Ipswich, he was usually the person people called when they found a snake inside their home. I think it's fair to say Warren had spent most of his career dealing with snakes, especially eastern browns, and he often joked that he'd probably relocated more than 4,000 of them by then. By early afternoon, dispatch forwarded Warren a relocation request from a homeowner named Patrice Voller, 45. The shed behind Patrice's house backed against an overgrown fence line cluttered with timber, paint cans, and potting mix. Eastern brown snakes thrive around those environments because rodents gather near cluttered sheds and stored feed. Adults regularly exceed 5 feet in length and move with explosive speed. Their venom can trigger rapid cardiovascular collapse, clotting abnormalities, paralysis, and cardiac arrest after significant envenomation. According to Patrice, she heard scraping behind the shed wall earlier that morning and found fresh snake tracks beneath shelving near the back corner. When she called dispatch, she mentioned hearing movement in more than one location inside the shed. Inside the shed, the concrete floor was still warm from the morning heat, and the walls were crowded with paint tins, tools, and old lawn equipment that left plenty of dark spaces for snakes to hide. Warren quickly spotted the first eastern brown partly curled beneath a lawnmower near the entrance. It probably looked like a routine call to him, so he pinned the snake carefully with the hook, guided it into a cloth bag, and carried it back toward the relocation container in his truck. But what Warren never noticed was the movement behind a stack of paint cans near the back wall. Later, Patrice's phone recording briefly showed a second eastern brown sliding deeper into the shadows, and this is very dangerous, because with snakes like that, losing focus for even a couple seconds is sometimes all it takes. After securing the first snake, Warren stepped back toward the shed entrance to grab extra ties for the transport bag. However, a second eastern brown emerged low along the wall and struck almost immediately. Patrice later said she did not realize another snake existed until Warren jerked backward, hard enough to slam his shoulder against the shed frame. The snake bit him once above the ankle through his sock and work trousers, before disappearing beneath shelving again. Warren grabbed the wall to steady himself, then sat outside on an overturned clay pot. At first, Warren stayed surprisingly calm. Patrice later said he calmly told her to call emergency services while he loosened his pant leg and checked the bite himself. Honestly, I think that reaction came from doing the job for so many years. He kept telling her not to panic while 2 small puncture marks slowly bled through the fabric near his ankle. Halfway through the wait, visible deterioration began. Patrice later described Warren pausing strangely between sentences, as though he could not organize his thoughts properly. Sweat soaked through his work shirt despite sitting in shade. His breathing grew heavier while blood slowly dripped from one nostril onto the patio concrete. Then his legs stopped supporting him entirely. Warren slid sideways off the clay pot. Patrice's video captured him trying once to push himself upright before collapsing flat onto the concrete. Within seconds, his movement slowed and his breathing turned uneven as he lost consciousness. When paramedics arrived, Warren was already in cardiac arrest. Crews continued resuscitation during transport toward Ipswich Hospital, while paramedics alerted emergency staff to prepare antivenom immediately, but he was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. Wildlife officers later returned to the property and found the second eastern brown still hidden behind the paint cans. The coroner later confirmed Warren died from severe eastern brown snake envenomation, which caused rapid cardiovascular collapse and catastrophic blood clotting failure throughout his body. The case only received a short stretch of local news coverage, and the break-breaking part, his retirement cake, was still sitting inside a bakery refrigerator when Barbara got the call from the hospital that evening. After 40 years handling snakes, Warren still died from the one he never saw hiding behind him, and that same confidence around survival starts showing up again in this next story. Except this time the danger stopped feeling real to him long before the bite happened. It was July 18, 2016, in Barangay Namuak on the outskirts of Tuguegarao City, where days of monsoon rain had flooded rice fields, overflowed irrigation canals, and left muddy water pooled beneath scattered bamboo homes. Humid air carried the smell of wet soil, stagnant runoff, livestock waste, and smoke drifting from roadside cooking fires. Ferdinand Macareg, who most people in the area called Bong Bong, was 58 years old and worked as a traditional healer. People turned to after snake bites, especially on places with no reliable access to anti-venom. He lived beside rice paddies in a worn concrete and bamboo house where farmers often arrived carrying relatives bitten by cobras or pit vipers during planting season. Bong Bong treated them using herbal poultices, heated coconut oil, pressure wraps, and remedies passed down from his grandfather. And in small communities, when enough people survive after coming to someone like that, word spreads fast. So he gained his popularity over time. And that's probably the reason why Bong Bong had become increasingly confident during public demonstrations. According to his neighbors, he occasionally handled cobras after drinking gin and sometimes provoked controlled strikes against his forearm. Unknown to spectators, he often stressed the same snakes beforehand, increasing the likelihood of reduced venom delivery. When a small television station from Tuguegarao contacted him about filming a human interest segment, he agreed immediately, believing the attention might bring more patients to the property. The treatment room sat behind the house beneath a rusted corrugated roof surrounded by flooded rice fields buzzing with insects after rain. Philippine cobras thrive in wet agricultural environments where rodents gather around standing water. Adults usually grow between 3 and 5 feet long and possess potent neurotoxic venom, capable of rapidly paralyzing the muscles responsible for breathing. There were already warning signs before the filming even started. Lena, his wife, had argued with Bong Bong earlier that morning because the youngest cobra had been acting unusually aggressive during feedings. The snake had only been captured 4 months earlier from flooded rice fields near Peña Blanca, and unlike the others, it had never been used around people before. The interview stayed relaxed for almost an hour until the reporter jokingly asked if Bong Bong was actually immune to cobra venom. Personally, I think that probably pushed him into trying to prove something. Witnesses later said the room went quiet as Bong Bong walked over to the clay jars stacked near the wall. The moment he loosened the cloth covering one of them, the cobra lunged upward hard enough to shift the lid before his hand even went inside. Lena immediately told him to stop, but he ignored her. Bong Bong reached into the jar with his bare hand, and the cobra struck almost immediately. Its fangs hit the inside of his right wrist, near the veins, and he pulled back hard enough for blood to run down his forearm, while the snake dropped onto the bamboo floor beneath a plastic chair. People scrambled backward as the cobra moved between their feet. At first, witnesses thought everything Bong Bong had survived snake bites before, but that changed when he stopped talking and stared quietly at the wound. Within minutes, one of his eyelids began drooping, his speech became slurred, and thick saliva gathered around his mouth. And like most of our deadly snakebite cases, once the breathing starts failing, the ending is usually not far behind. A barangay health worker arrived on a motorcycle about 15 minutes later, but there was no anti-venom available locally. Flooded roads also prevented an ambulance from reaching the house, so Emil and several neighbors placed Bong Bong in the back of a pickup truck and drove toward the nearest rural clinic. During the drive, his breathing became shallow and uneven before he stopped responding entirely. He was pronounced dead shortly after arrival from respiratory paralysis caused by severe cobra envenomation. A coroner summary later listed the cause of death as fatal neurotoxic snake envenomation, consistent with a Philippine cobra bite, resulting in respiratory failure and oxygen deprivation. The television station never aired the segment and extended financial help to Bong Bong's family. Wildlife officials later removed the remaining cobras from the property. After his death, neighbors avoided the abandoned treatment room after dark for years afterward. Bong Bong spent years convincing people he understood cobra venom better than doctors did. By the end, he treated surviving bites almost like proof he couldn't die from one. Saifo's story feels completely different to me because he wasn't chasing attention at all. It was November 17th, 2016, on the outskirts of Umlazi near Durban, South Africa, where humid evening heat lingered over crowded concrete homes, beside trash-lined drainage canals, and tall grass moving in the wind. Insects swarmed beneath flickering streetlights, while distant thunder rolled across the township after a day of heavy coastal humidity. Saifo Dlamini was 20 years old and had been obsessed with snakes for most of his life. He came from a family of snake handlers, and relatives later said he received his first pet snake as a gift when he was 16. Around Umlazi, neighbors already knew him as the person to call when cobras showed up beneath washing machines or vipers crossed dirt paths near outdoor toilets, which is for me quite impressive for someone his age. Unlike a lot of young handlers online chasing views, Saifo actually studied what he was doing. According to his family, Sifo spent years reading reptile guides, watching handling videos, and learning directly from older relatives who caught snakes around the township. So you can actually tell this wasn't just some random hobby for him. By 20, he already owned several reptiles and handled local snake removals, using equipment he slowly paid for himself through phone repairs and other small jobs. Most people later described Sifo the same way: calm, patient, and careful around snakes. He lived with his mother and younger sister near a canal filled with trash, tall grass, and rats, the kind of place where snakes showed up so often that people stopped reacting to every sighting. Because he grew up around them, Sifo handled dangerous snakes with a level of comfort that honestly would have terrified most people. Earlier that afternoon, he received a call from a groundskeeper near a primary school outside Umlazi after children spotted a large puff adder hiding beneath corrugated metal sheets beside a soccer field. Witnesses later said Sifo handled it professionally. He moved the children back, pinned the snake carefully with the hook, and secured it inside a locked plastic container without any trouble. After sunset, Sifo sat outside cleaning his equipment, while Lethiwe invited a few school friends into the back room, where the puff adder's container sat beneath an old table fan. At first, Sifo refused to show them the snake. Eventually, he slid the lid open slightly and repeated the same warning he always gave kids: never trust a puff adder that looks calm. One of the boys then asked if the snake was actually dangerous or just lazy because it barely moved, and I think that question got into Sifo's head a little. Wanting to show how controlled the snake seemed, Sifo reopened the container and reached inside barehanded, trying to grip the puff adder just behind the head before lifting it out. But the strike happened instantly. The snake whipped sideways and drove both fangs deep into the base of his right thumb and palm before recoiling into a tight defensive coil. Sifo screamed and stumbled backward into the wall as blood ran from the puncture wounds. The boys bolted through the doorway yelling, while Sifo forced himself to stay calm long enough to secure the container lid with his left hand. He wrapped cloth loosely around the bite and told Lethiwe to find a ride immediately instead of waiting for an ambulance. During the drive, swelling spread quickly through his hand and wrist while burning pain moved up his forearm. Halfway to the hospital, Sifo started vomiting repeatedly in the back seat. By the time they arrived roughly 30 minutes later, the swelling had already moved past his wrist, and dark bruising surrounded the bite. Doctors gave antivenom and started emergency treatment overnight, but the damage kept getting worse. Large blood-filled blisters formed across his hand and forearm, while pressure inside the tissue began cutting off circulation. Surgeons eventually amputated his arm below the wrist early the next morning after the tissue could no longer be saved. Hours later, his kidneys began failing from the venom and severe muscle breakdown. And this is the part people sometimes forget about snake bites. Even if doctors stop the immediate bleeding or swelling, the damage inside the body can keep spreading for hours afterward. Sifo continued deteriorating despite intensive care and died about 18 hours after the bite. Neighbor Thabiso Kumalo later said he drove Sifo to the hospital after hearing screaming from the house. The coroner listed the cause of death as multi-organ failure caused by severe puff adder envenomation, complicated by tissue necrosis, shock, and acute kidney injury. After the funeral, relatives worked with local wildlife officers to remove the remaining snakes from Sifo's room, including the pet python he had raised since he was 16. His mother reportedly refused to keep any reptiles in the house afterward. Sifo was careful. He was trying to build a future for himself, and one split-second decision in front of a few kids destroyed everything he had worked toward. And after all the overconfidence in the earlier stories, Nadawit's case becomes terrifying for the opposite reason. It was March 14, 2017, outside Chiang Mai, Thailand, where damp morning fog drifted through banana trees surrounding a small roadside reptile park, reopening after weeks of repairs. Humid air clung to the enclosures, while condensation dripped from artificial vines and muddy tire tracks cut through the gravel parking area. Nadawut Sengjan was 41 and had spent nearly 20 years working at a reptile park outside Chiang Mai. He started out cleaning cages before eventually becoming the senior keeper trusted with venomous snakes. Co-workers respected him because he never treated the job like a show, and that probably kept him alive around dangerous animals for as long as it did. March 14th was also his wedding anniversary. Before sunrise, his wife Maylee packed sticky rice and mango into his lunch bag and slipped an anniversary note into the side pocket. Nadawut promised he'd leave work early, since the tropical wing only needed final cleaning before reopening. The tropical enclosure was filled with artificial vines, misting systems, and elevated canopy platforms designed to imitate rainforest conditions. During the renovation work, staff had repeatedly moved smaller venomous snakes between temporary containers, while replacing lighting and drainage systems. Investigators later believed a juvenile Malayan pit viper had accidentally remained hidden inside the upper canopy during one of those transfers. And that kind of mistake is more common than people think. From what I learned about juvenile pit vipers, they tend to stay motionless and blend almost perfectly into wet leaves and shaded branches, which makes them easy to miss, even for experienced handlers. What made the incident worse was that the warning signs were already there. Staff later admitted some temporary snake containers had been mislabeled during the rushed reopening, and one junior keeper even reported seeing movement high in the vines earlier that morning but brushed it off as a gecko or small lizard. At around 9:40 a.m., surveillance cameras showed Natawut entering the enclosure carrying a debris bucket and rake. He cleared clogged drains and removed rotting leaves from the elevated platforms before reaching into a dense cluster of branches near the humid rear corner of the exhibit. That's where the strike happened. Security footage later showed him pulling his hand back sharply before rubbing it against his work pants. The juvenile pit viper had bitten him between the thumb and index finger before disappearing back into the vines. Because the puncture wounds barely bled at first, Natawut reportedly assumed he had scraped his hand on damaged wire or rough branches. He finished cleaning and walked back toward the keeper office without immediately reporting the injury. About 20 minutes later, co-workers noticed swelling spreading across the back of his hand while dark bruising slowly formed around the puncture marks. Severe pain soon traveled through his wrist and forearm. Natawut radioed for the facility veterinarian, but became pale and dizzy while walking toward the treatment room. Witnesses later said he nearly collapsed against the office doorway before co-workers helped him sit down. By then, bleeding had started around the puncture site and along his gums, which immediately raised concerns about venom-related clotting problems. Staff began searching the enclosure while another employee called emergency services. Nearly 40 minutes after the bite, another keeper finally spotted the juvenile pit viper still coiled among artificial branches above the same canopy corner. Co-workers loaded Natawut into a facility truck and drove toward the hospital while paramedics intercepted them along the highway. During transport, the swelling spread past his wrist, and intense internal pain developed through his arm and chest. Hospital testing later confirmed severe venom-induced coagulopathy, consistent with Malayan pit viper envenomation. Anti-venom and blood products were administered shortly after arrival. For several hours, doctors believed his condition had stabilized, but later that evening, internal bleeding complications worsened significantly. Natawut developed a massive intracranial hemorrhage caused by the venom's clotting effects, a rare but documented complication in severe pit viper bites. He lost consciousness in intensive care and died several hours later despite emergency intervention. The coroner later listed the cause of death as fatal intracranial hemorrhage and venom-induced consumptive coagulopathy following Malayan pit viper envenomation. The reptile park temporarily shut down the tropical wing during the investigation. When Mali later collected Natawut's belongings from the hospital, the folded anniversary note was still sitting unopened inside his lunch bag beside the untouched sticky rice and mango. Natawut didn't ignore warnings or try to impress anybody. He just reached into the wrong patch of leaves during a routine cleanup, and that tiny mistake ended up killing him. Roy's story feels even heavier because the warning signs were obvious before anyone ever touched the snake. It was October 13, 2013, near Newport, Tennessee, where overnight rain left Appalachian back roads slick with mud and fallen leaves while dense fog drifted through hardwood forests surrounding isolated mountain churches. Cold air pushed through warped wooden walls as hymn singing echoed across damp hills. Beneath a dark gray afternoon sky, Roy Elkins was 61 years old and had spent most of his life handling venomous snakes inside small holiness churches across eastern Tennessee and southeastern Kentucky. His family had practiced serpent handling for generations, so Roy basically grew up around it. He used to watch his grandfather preach with rattlesnakes draped across his shoulders while church members sang hymns inside crowded mountain chapels. And when someone is raised around dangerous animals that long, the fear starts getting replaced by routine. By his 30s, Roy was already considered one of the more respected serpent handlers in those Appalachian church circles, the kind of person younger members listened to because he'd survived handling snakes for decades. And I believe that history made it even harder for him to question whether something could finally go wrong. That Sunday mattered personally too, because his daughter Leah had recently returned home after months of arguing with him about the church. Roy reportedly told several deacons he hoped she would finally understand the blessing after watching another handling ceremony in person. The church itself sat deep in the hills, surrounded by wet forest and muddy trails. Timber rattlesnakes were common in that region, and large adults can deliver venom strong enough to damage blood vessels, disrupt clotting, and cause dangerous swelling, especially if the bite lands near the neck or face. Several warning signs appeared before the service began. The rattlesnake Roy selected had only been at the church for a few months. After another handler warned him, it reacted unpredictably around loud crowds. Witnesses recalled the snake rattling unusually early during setup. One church member suggested using a smaller snake because the rattlesnake's eyes appeared cloudy from early shedding. Roy ignored the concern because he wanted Leah to witness what he considered a real sign of faith. As the sermon intensified, the church became louder and hotter. Roy lifted the rattlesnake across his shoulders while pacing slowly through the aisle, preaching toward Leah's section. Several people later said the snake already seemed agitated, tightening repeatedly around Roy's arm instead of hanging loosely. The strike happened during a simple adjustment. Roy shifted the snake slightly higher across his shoulders while turning back toward the altar. The rattlesnake suddenly twisted downward toward his neck. Witnesses described hearing a sharp smack echo through the sanctuary before Leah screamed from the front pew. The snake struck beneath the right side of Roy's jaw and held briefly before releasing, leaving 2 deep puncture wounds high along the neck. Blood immediately ran beneath his collar onto the front of his shirt. Roy did not drop the snake. Even after the bite, he tightened his grip instinctively and continued preaching briefly while swelling began forming beneath his jaw. Another handler eventually secured the rattlesnake inside a wooden box near the altar. Over the next several minutes, swelling spread along Roy's jaw and throat, while his breathing became louder and harsher. Witnesses described him repeatedly swallowing and holding his neck, like his struggling to breathe. Leah finally called 911 approximately 4 minutes after the bite. Because of isolated mountain roads and heavy fog, paramedics required nearly 18 minutes to reach the church. By then, Roy was barely responsive, and severe neck swelling complicated airway management almost immediately. A medical helicopter was requested, but worsening airway obstruction and poor weather prevented safe transfer. Roy lost consciousness shortly afterward, before suffering respiratory failure and cardiac arrest during treatment beside the altar. A coroner summary later listed the cause of death as severe timber rattlesnake envenomation, resulting in airway compromise, venom-induced coagulopathy, and respiratory failure. Coverage stayed limited to Appalachian newspapers and regional Tennessee stations. Leah never returned after the funeral. Everybody inside that church saw the rattlesnake was already agitated, but once the service started, nobody wanted to be the person who stopped it. And honestly, that pressure to keep going no matter what is what makes Shane's story hit me the hardest. It was October 14th, 2017 in Clayton County outside Atlanta, where steady afternoon rain left the air thick and humid around a converted warehouse tucked behind wet pine trees and cracked industrial pavement. Inside, humming filtration systems echoed through narrow rows of heated enclosures, while condensation gathered along glass panels and concrete floors remained slick from tracked-in rainwater. Shane Adams was 38 years old and trying to rebuild a life most people considered finished. Through most of his 20s, he moved between armed robbery charges, addiction, probation violations, and county jail. A prison sentence after a pharmacy robbery in Macon forced him into structure for the first time in years. During incarceration, Shane joined a small inmate animal care program, handling abandoned reptiles and injured wildlife. Reptiles became the first thing he studied seriously. After his release in 2014, a rehabilitation nonprofit helped place him at a reptile rescue facility south of Atlanta, specializing in surrendered and confiscated exotic animals. The facility operated under state permits, allowing temporary housing of venomous non-native species during investigations and transfers. Shane started cleaning cages, thawing rodents, and assisting with non-venomous transfers. Staff trusted him because he never rushed and never handled dangerous animals for attention. Senior keepers eventually trained him on venom room procedures involving hooks, shift boxes, feeding hatches, and bite response protocols. Shane treated the job almost like probation for his future. The reptile facility occupied an aging warehouse behind an industrial service road lined with wet pine trees and rusting chain link fencing. Forest cobras are among Africa's largest venomous snakes and can grow longer than 8 feet. Their venom attacks the nervous system and gradually shuts down the muscles needed for breathing. Based on my research, what makes them especially dangerous is how unpredictable they can be. 1 second they stay completely still, and the next they strike with almost no warning at all. Several warning signs already existed before Shane entered the venom room. The forest cobra involved in the incident had been confiscated 3 weeks earlier from an illegal private collector and had been showing unstable defensive behavior ever since. Sometimes it hooted aggressively, while other times it stayed completely still beneath cover, before suddenly lunging without warning. Because of that unpredictability, the facility director had already ordered that nobody work the enclosure alone. But the rescue center was short-staffed that Saturday. 2 volunteers had called out sick, and another senior handler was transporting animals to a veterinary partner nearly an hour away. At approximately 2:17 p.m., Shane entered the venom room alone, while another employee handled calls nearby. Surveillance footage later showed him following procedure carefully as he approached the feeding hatch with the hook. The forest cobra stayed hidden beneath cork bark near the back of the enclosure until Shane adjusted the partially opened hatch. The snake exploded forward almost instantly. Security footage later showed the cobra reaching the opening before Shane could fully react. He tried sealing the hatch while stepping backward, but the snake struck upward through the narrow gap and bit the left side of his neck just below the jaw. And most handlers know a neck bite is one of the worst places to get hit because the venom can spread through the body incredibly fast from there. Shane stumbled into a metal shelving rack before pulling the emergency cord beside the enclosures. Blood ran beneath his collar while he pressed against the puncture wounds and struggled to keep the hatch secured with the hook. Within minutes, co-workers noticed his speech becoming slurred, while his eyelids started drooping heavily. Another employee reached the room about 90 seconds after the alarm. By then, Shane was barely able to stay upright while trying to tell staff where the anti-venom refrigerator key was kept. His breathing was already becoming shallow. Paramedics arrived roughly 11 minutes later and found paralysis spreading through the muscles controlling his airway. Crews immediately began airway support during transport, while the hospital prepared anti-venom. Roughly 30 minutes after the bite, Shane suffered respiratory arrest inside the ambulance despite continued ventilation attempts. He was pronounced dead less than an hour after the strike. A coroner summary later listed the cause of death as acute neurotoxic envenomation, resulting in respiratory failure caused by paralysis and oxygen deprivation. And for someone who spent years trying to rebuild his life around rescuing dangerous animals, it's hard not to think about how the same cobra he was trying to care for ended up killing him.